give it another minute or two for a few more attendees to join, and we'll start in about 2 minutes. Thanks everyone for waiting a couple of minutes there. Looks like we've got a quorum, so we'll get going. Good morning. My name's Matthew Knight. I'm calling in from Gadigal land, where we're enjoying some delightful spring Sydney weather. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present of those traditional custodians of these lands and any Indigenous folk attending our call today. So a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Welcome to the Solar Sunshot program launch webinar. Please feel free to use the Teams Q&A function at the top of your browser bar there as we go. Pop any questions you may have in there, and the team will note them in the background as we go to answer them in the Q&A session at the end. If we don't get to any of your questions today, or if we don't come across some information in the webinar that you were hoping to see, please feel free to also reach out via email. We'll put up our contact details at the end of the webinar. We'll also be making a recording available of the webinar on the website in the coming days. As I said, my name is Matt, and I'm joined by our CEO, Darren Miller, and my colleague, Stan Sturrock, the Director in the Business Development and Transactions team at Arena, overseeing solar investments, and Jeff, Aidan, James, and myself working alongside Dan in that BDT team. While we've booked 1.5 hours today, we hope to use up to an hour of your time, unless we have a flurry of questions. We're targeting about 30 minutes of Arena presenting to you, followed by Q&A, and we'll cover some background about Arena, an overview of the Sunshot program, the structure of rounds 1A and 1B, and we'll wrap up with links, dates, and next steps, and leave some time for Q&A at the end. I'll now pass to our CEO, Darren Miller, who will take you through a bit about Arena as an organisation. Darren?
Matt, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar today. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for your time and your contribution to this process, both in the past and in expectation going forward. Well, I was just reflecting earlier this morning that it was only on the 28th of March, so less than 6 months ago, when the Prime Minister, Minister Albanese, announced the Solar Sunshot program at the Liddell Power Station. And it was obviously a significant commitment of $1 billion to establish Australia's position in the solar manufacturing supply chain. And Arena was delighted to be offered the opportunity to, along with the department, to consult on the program and ultimately develop the guidelines that we have published. And fantastic to formally launch the program in this webinar today. And Just wanted to thank many of you for your contributions through the consultation period, working very closely with my team and the team in the department. And we look forward to very fruitful interactions over the next few months as the program rolls out and submissions come in. Look, it's worth just stepping back and reflecting on the very important role that solar PV in particular will have on Australia's and the global energy transition. We certainly know that solar stands to essentially underpin the renewable energy generation portfolio in Australia, obviously along with wind, but solar has its own unique place in that opportunity. And as we sit here today with a market that's installing around about 5 gigawatts a year of solar PV, 3 or so on rooftop and 2 or so on land at the utility scale, we're looking forward to a future where that's scaled up by a significant amount, an order of magnitude. In fact, we want to see a future where we have 50 gigawatts or more per annum of solar deployed in Australia. And as we think through that opportunity, that's going to require both very low cost solar, both in terms of components, high quality components, as well as unique ways, uninvented ways, if you like, of installing solar at large scale to realize the cost advantages and ways of deploying that solar at scale throughout Australia that haven't been contemplated yet. Clearly, a very important part of that vision is being able to ensure that we have access to high quality, low cost, world leading, in fact, solar components and other hardware and software to make that happen. And the Solar Sunshot initiative is really Australia's first attempt, if you like, serious attempt at securing a place for Australia in that supply chain and ensuring that we have a resilient supply chain throughout that energy transition. We all know that Australia has actually a lot to offer the solar supply chain. We're a leading research country. We have invented in Australia the core technology that's in the majority of today's solar PV technology, the PERC technology. The ANU and UNSW and other institutions in Australia are world-renowned for their work in the space. We also know that we're a leading end market for solar. We have the world's highest penetration of rooftop solar PV in Australia, and we're a growing market for land-based utility scale solar. And as I said, we have a vision to scale that up by at least an order of magnitude. What we're missing is the connection between that important research that's done in Australia and the ultimate deployment where we're leading and intend to lead in the future. And so what this is looking at is developing capabilities to have Australian innovators and researchers take their innovations forward beyond just the laboratories and into the manufacturing space, and have Australia play a meaningful role in the manufacturing of solar components, all the way from the end modules, if you like, and working back up the supply chain right through to the raw materials that make up solar PV panels. So that's in effect the rationale for what we're doing here. It's a very important opportunity. It's not without risk and challenges, but it's got a great opportunity here for Australia and for many of you. And I thank you for your cooperation, collaboration towards that end goal. Matt, if we could just put on screen, I'm just going to share some thoughts just about ARENA and our journey and where solar fits into what we're doing. So most of you would know about ARENA, but for those who don't, I'll just cover briefly that we are Australia's Renewable Energy Innovation Agency. We are now 12 years old, having been established in 2012. And our objectives are to support improvements in the competitiveness of the technologies and to increase the supply of renewable energy in Australia. And more recently, as of 2 years ago, have been added essentially the why behind all of that, which is to facilitate Australia's greenhouse gas emissions targets and obviously to help mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, which is what we're all here to do. The methods by which we do that are primarily through providing financial support in the form of grants and by sharing knowledge. A very important feature of what we do is the knowledge sharing function, but sharing knowledge of what we learn so that others can learn more quickly and avoid making mistakes that have been made by others, but benefiting from the work that has been done before others. If we have a look at, Matt, just turning to the next slide, where ARENA has operated over the past 12 years, you can see we've had projects right throughout every state and territory of Australia. We have committed over $2.6 billion of funding to those projects, The project value, in fact, is now adding up to $12.6 billion. So in fact, the funding that ARENA has provided has leveraged $3.84 of third-party funding for every dollar of ARENA funding. And that's an important feature of the work we do. We are not and never are the sole funder. In fact, we like to stay under 50% of the total project value. But you can see that in demonstration and deployment projects in particular, our funding that we provide is a small minority of the percentage of the total project value. We've worked right across the spectrum from things like bioenergy and geothermal in the early days to what is our core work today, which is grid integration, elements of solar storage, storage of energy, for example, for the grid and for industry, increasingly working in hydrogen over the past 4 or 5 years, and that's through the lens of renewable or green hydrogen, and more latterly into things like low emissions metals and electric vehicle charging networks. The next slide over the page, my final slide before I hand back to the team, is just to share our core 5 strategic priority areas, which have over the last 4 or 5 years been to optimize the transition to renewable electricity. That's all about renewable energy coming into the grid and having higher and higher shares of renewable energy in the grid, commercializing renewable hydrogen, which is all about electrolysis and green hydrogen right now. ARENA has committed to over 60 projects and about $350 million to hydrogen projects to date. We're supporting the transition for low emissions metals, particularly the alumina and aluminium sector and the green steel, green iron opportunity. And we're helping to decarbonize transport, both in passenger vehicles and charging networks, as well as working into the heavier vehicles and fleets, for example. At the bottom of that slide, you can see we also deliver a range of budget measures, which are specific programs that the government has tasked ARENA with delivering, including, importantly today, the Solar Sunshot program, which is the $1 billion program, which we're launching the first phases of that today, but also including Hydrogen Head Start, which now is a $4 billion program across rounds 1 and 2, and various other things like community batteries and sustainable aviation fuel. The final call out is just to say on the left-hand side, for almost the very first time, we have broken out ultra-low-cost solar as its own strategic priority for ARENA, giving recognition to the very important role that solar energy will play in our future, both in terms of cost reductions, capability development, and in today's webinar, development of supply chains and resilience in those supply chains to see that opportunity through to its conclusion. It's a very important role that we play. It's a very important priority for both ARENA Australia and, frankly, for the globe. And we very much look forward to the work we're going to do with you through this program to make that happen. With that, let me hand over to Jeff in my team, who's going to take you through more of the details of the program. Thank you all.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you for that good background. And now we'll start stepping into some of the more detail around the program that's just announced. So ARENA has consulted extensively with industry and the government in the development of the Solar Sunshot program. The next section will describe the program structure and the overarching objectives that were informed through the process. Next slide, please. The Solar Sunshot program consists of an overarching program guidelines, excuse me, with funding allocated through funding rounds dedicated to specific focus areas. The enabling documents are the program guidelines and the funding announcements. The guidelines describe the overarching objectives as well as the procedures and the requirements of the program. The guidelines do not address the detailed assessment information. The funding announcements provide more detail, including specific objectives and the merit criteria that projects will be assessed against. This structure allows ARENA to respond to market readiness and focus funding on the areas that need it most, with the potential for future rounds. As of 31 August, 2 rounds are open. Round 1A is aimed at addressing solar PV manufacturing innovation, and Round 1B is designed to support feasibility and FEED studies for commercial scale solar PV manufacturing facilities. Details of the rounds will be provided by James and Aidan in later sections. Next slide, please. This slide states the program's high-level objectives, as described in the program guidelines. Firstly, to commercialise Australian solar PV innovations domestically and in order to grow and diversify our economy. As discussed by Darren earlier, this objective recognises that many of the key innovations in solar PV were developed within Australian universities. However, despite leading in solar PV R&D, Australia has struggled to commercialise local innovation. Solar Sunshot provides the opportunity to change this. And the second objective is to enhance Australian solar manufacturing to build a resilient supply chain in the long term. With solar PV likely to form the core of our generation mix in Australia out to 2050, it's critical that we ensure our solar PV supply chain is resilient in order to de-risk the transformation of the energy sector and Australia's renewable energy superpower vision. Next slide, please. Solar Sunshot forms part of the government's Future Made in Australia policy agenda and provides a great opportunity to deliver benefits to Australians. On the screen, you can see the community benefit principles as they are defined in the program guidelines. This aligns with the definition in the Future Made in Australia bill. The community benefits are embedded within the program guidelines and the funding announcements. This is to ensure public investment and the private investment it attracts flows to communities in ways that benefit local workers and businesses. The community benefits are embedded in the merit criteria. That means projects will be assessed on how they have addressed these principles. For example, under Round 1A, applications will need to demonstrate as applicable how they will engage with communities, what the outcomes for local communities, including First Nation groups, will be, how the projects will contribute to regional transition priorities, and how the project design will realise outcomes that support the community benefit principles. All applications under Round 1A will be required to develop and implement a community benefit and engagement plan. And ARENA will work with applicants to consider how their specific project should reflect the community benefit principles. For Round 1B, the scope of studies should consider community benefits and how projects will engage with any impacted communities. And finally, the guidelines require that the ARENA board have consideration of these important principles in making funding decisions. Slide. That's the overall structure of the program. We'll now go through more detail on the two open rounds, 1A and 1B, which both opened last week. I'll pass to James Sinclair to take us through Round 1A first. James.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. In the next few slides, we will give an overview of Round 1A. This will include the objectives, scope, process, and assessment criteria. On this slide, we will look at the program's objectives and scopes. So specifically, Round 1A's objectives are to support a resilient and integrated domestic solar PV industry, support innovation and use of advanced automation in solar PV manufacturing and provide new economic opportunities, reduce barriers to solar PV manufacturing, and to develop pathways to enable sustainable and competitive solar PV supply chains, having regard for long-term economic, social, and environmental sustainability and the community benefits principles. In terms of scope, at this stage, we are looking for projects with the following characteristics. Commercial scale manufacturing of solar PV technologies of at least TRL 8 and CRI 3, that's technology readiness level and commercial readiness index. Solar PV modules, cells, and other module components such as framing and solar glass. Solar PV racking, tracking, and deployment technologies. The scope of this round includes both production credits and capital grants. The production credits awarded may be up to $350 million, and the capital grants may be up to $50 million. It's worth noting that technologies that are not TRL 8 or CRI 3 yet may be eligible for support under ARENA's other funding programs. We will now discuss an overview of the application process. So Round 1A will follow ARENA's typical two-stage application format. This will be an expression of interest followed by a full application. Key details of each stage are listed on the slide here. For clarity, some adjustments since consultation are that instead of a registration of interest step and then a one-stage full application assessment, we are proceeding with a two-stage assessment process. Similarly, the assessment process will not be ranked and communication with applicants will be open. So if you were following the consultation paper and period closely, these are some of the changes. The bottom of this slide highlights how these two stages fit amongst the broader process. So before the EOI, you can see the concept engagement stage. This is where we expect applicants to be contacting us as a first pass of assessing the application and to allow us to help you to put the best foot forward when applying. It allows familiarisation between ARENA and the applicant, and ARENA also reserves the right to undertake DD throughout the process. After the EOI and full application, it's worth noting that there are several steps before a funding agreement can be executed. This includes the project receiving ARENA board approval, as well as minister approval for grants over $50 million. And then with that approval, there is a contracting process. So please account for these in your timelines. Moving on to the assessment criteria. ARENA's process is comprised of two types of criteria. There is eligibility and merit criteria. On this slide, we are looking at the eligibility criteria. These are mandatory requirements for a project to be considered. If these are not met, the application will not proceed to merit assessment. In summary, applicants must be an Australian corporation, the project must take place in Australia, and applicants must agree to knowledge sharing. Applicants must also agree to a range of warrants that are set out in 4.16 to 4.23 in the guidelines. These include things like not being on the list of designated terrorists, complying with the Workplace Gender Equality Act, not having legal proceedings underway, and not being in breach of modern slavery compliance. We will now move to the merit criteria. This slide discusses the 5 merit criteria. Please consider this an overview rather than a comprehensive discussion. And as a note at the start, each of these 5 merit criteria are equally weighted in the assessment of a project. Merit criteria A assesses the project's alignment to the round's objectives. We will come back to this merit criteria in more detail on the next slide, as it is a little bit different to ARENA's typical, or it is the most different to ARENA's typical processes. Merit criteria B and E are somewhat similar to other ARENA programs. B considers the capability and capacity of the applicant and the project partners to deliver the project. This includes relevant experience in delivering similar projects and having the right capacity. We're asking an example question we might ask is this project a large step up from what your business currently does? Merit criterion C assesses how well designed and planned the project is. This will include permits and approvals, technical design, community engagement and benefits, risk management, project schedule. For a fuller list of what's assessed in merit criterion C, and for all of the merit criteria, please see the guidelines and funding announcements. Moving to merit criterion D as a summary, this is where we assess the project's financials. We consider things like, is the size of the ARENA grant appropriate? Are the budget and financial model assumptions well evidenced? Is there a credible financing plan? And is there a credible pathway to commercial viability? Merit criteria E assesses the learnings that the project will generate. We ask questions like, is the knowledge sharing targeted at specific audiences? How will the knowledge be collected and shared? And how valuable is the knowledge to be learned? Reiterating Jeff's earlier comments, the project's community benefits will be considered across each of these criteria. So as mentioned earlier, we will now look at merit criteria A in more detail, given it is the most specific to this round. So this is assessing the alignment of the project to the objectives of round 1A. As mentioned, the first objective is to support the development of a resilient and integrated solar PV supply chain. So this objective considers the overall integrated solar manufacturing ecosystem and the extent to which a project will benefit the development of resilient solar PV manufacturing, including by creating opportunities to integrate elements of the supply chain. The second objective is to support innovation and automation in PV manufacturing and providing new economic opportunities. This relates to module manufacturing and the other manufacturing components and considers the extent to which a project innovates on existing PV manufacturing techniques, inputs, deployment technologies, and products. Third, we want projects to reduce barriers to domestic solar PV manufacturing. This objective is about reduction or removal of barriers to module and other component manufacturing. When we talk about barriers, we are talking about one-off challenges or incremental improvements that once overcome, make the pathway to commerciality easier for the next projects. These could be commercial barriers, regulatory barriers, technical, social, permitting, or other. Finally, the fourth objective is to develop pathways to ensure sustainable and competitive solar PV supply chains, having regard for long-term economic, social, and environmental sustainability, as well as the community benefit principles. This objective is how we ensure manufacturing is viable for the long term. Projects will be assessed on how they improve the economics of manufacturing, how they support community engagement, benefit, and social license. And this objective will consider outcomes for local community, including First Nations groups, and the extent to which the project contributes to net zero emissions transformation in the region. So I will now move to talk about the documents that applicants will need to prepare to demonstrate merit against each of these criteria. At the EOI stage, we are asking for a project plan, a financial model, budget, sources and uses table, letters of support, and other documents for due diligence. The project plan is the primary document. It should contain all project information not covered in the other attachments. Much of merit criteria B and C is based on this document. The financial model is the key document for assessing merit criteria D. We are looking for models that can be sensitized and include evidence of assumptions, cost of production, module or other component pricing, production credit value, and the financial returns to the applicant and project partners. The sources and uses table is a summary of project costs in an easy to interpret snapshot. A template for this is provided on our Sunshot website. And now looking at the full application to highlight the differences. The project plan at full application is expected to include more detail, given that the project should be further progressed. The full application also requires a risk management plan, community engagement and benefit plan, and a recruitment plan. These will also be used to assess merit criteria B and C. A full application also requires a knowledge sharing plan. This is used to assess merit criteria E. ARENA also provides a template for this on our webpage. And finally, at the full application, we also require a compliance table for the funding agreement or term sheet. This is the project's opportunity to flag any departures from ARENA's legal templates that they would like to request. So this brings us to the end of our round 1A discussion, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Aidan Pang to take us through round 1B.
Yeah, thanks, James, and hi, everyone. We'll now jump into our discussion of round 1B. So the round 1B objectives and scope. In round 1B, we'll be funding feasibility studies or engineering studies, which we'll collectively refer to as studies, which support the round objectives as listed here. Round 1B has 3 objectives, which are the same as the first 3 objectives from round 1A, which James has previously covered. However, you can see the scope of round B here is different. So round 1B will support studies on commercial scale manufacturing of solar PV technologies, including, but not limited to, polysilicon and conversion of quartz to metallurgical silicon, ingots and wafers, and broader solar innovation, which is consistent with the achievement of ARENA's Solar 30-30-30 goal. Capital grants for these studies are expected to be between $1 and $5 million, and we expect the ARENA contributions to make up no more than 50% of the study. So looking at round 1B, it is a single stage assessment, and this slide sets out our proposed single stage merit-based application process for round 1B. So applicants are encouraged to contact ARENA to discuss their study before submitting their full application. ARENA can provide you guidance on the suitability of your study against the program guidelines and funding announcements. Applications can be submitted at any time up to the closing date, seen here is 12th of November 2025. And these applications will also be assessed against eligibility and merit criteria, which I'll cover in a moment. After assessment outcomes are finalised, ARENA will recommend successful studies to the ARENA CEO or board for approval of funding. Once that study is approved by ARENA, ARENA will then commence the funding agreement negotiations. So now looking at the round 1B eligibility and merit criteria, the ARENA assessment process is comprised of 2 types of criteria, which are the eligibility and merit. So eligibility criteria are the mandatory requirements for the study to be considered, and if these are not met, the application will not proceed to the merit assessment. The first 3 criteria ensure participation from Australian entities, and that benefits from the study flow to the Australian market. There must be a feasibility or an engineering study, and we've included a definition of these in the round 1B funding announcement. The merit criteria consider the advantages and value of the study on a quantitative and qualitative basis, and these are the alignment to the round 1B objectives, applicant capability and capacity to undertake the study design, methodology, risk and compliance, and the financial viability and co-funding commitment. The 4 merit criteria for round 1B will be equally weighted. It's worth noting that the overall structure of this information is relatively common across ARENA programs and was covered earlier in detail by James. So for more detail, please refer to the funding announcement and guidelines. So we'll now look at the requirements for a full application. So as mentioned before, round 1B will be a single stage process where applicants will submit just a full application. So for the studies, the requirements of the full application are largely similar across feasibility engineering studies, with the key requirements shown here. The study plan is the primary document and should contain all study information that is not covered in other attachments. Assessment of merit criteria B and C is largely based on the study plan. The budget sources and uses table is to summarize the study costs in an easy to interpret manner and provide us a quick view of your income and then expenditure for the study. The risk management plan should identify key risks to the study, achieving its objectives, and your proposed approach to mitigate those risks. Funding agreement compliance table will give applicants the opportunity to flag any departures from ARENA's legal templates. And in addition to these, applicants can share other documents such as letters of support, key personnel CVs, and anything else that will support their application. The specific requirements for the feasibility and engineering studies are detailed in Appendix A of the Round 1B funding announcement, and we encourage applicants to check this to ensure that all required information is included in applications. Highlighting again that under a single stage process, we expect that these documents will be well advanced and developed. There will be no opportunity for ARENA to provide feedback on draft material. So that brings us to the end of the Round 1B discussion. I'll now pass back to Matthew, who will wrap us up.
Great. Thanks, Aidan. That's it of the content today, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us through a whirlwind run through of the Sunshot program rounds 1A and 1B. It's been our pleasure to talk to you today about Sunshot. To summarise, ARENA has been asked to support the development of each stage of the solar PV manufacturing supply chain through the distribution of $1 billion in grant funding. And we've presented today some important details and considerations from the Sunshot program's recently released program guidelines, in particular rounds 1A and 1B. The key outcome of today is to inform you about the program, I guess, but also to encourage you to consider developing a high quality project that is eligible to apply. In terms of next steps, the program is now open for submissions under both rounds with closing dates, as you can see on the screen. And if you have any further questions regarding Sunshot that we don't get to today, please feel free to send them to solarsunshot@arena.gov.au. You can see that email address at the bottom right. And if Solar Sunshot isn't looking like the funding round for you, but you're still interested in whether funding is available from ARENA for another project you've got, for example, something elsewhere in solar PV deployment or innovation, or even non-solar projects in some of the other topics Darren mentioned at the beginning, such as storage or low emission metals or other areas, please feel free to contact proposals@arena.gov.au down the bottom right there. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to anyone you know at ARENA as well, or anyone you've previously worked with. The QR code on the screen there will take you to our website, arena.gov.au, where you can find all those details and the documents that we've referred to today, such as the guidelines. Feel free to scan that QR code before I move on. All right, moving along. So we'll now begin Q&A. So you should see a Q&A function in the top of your Teams window, as I mentioned at the start. Click that to send through your best questions. They won't pop up for anyone else to see, so all good. Our team will flick through those in the background and start to get through them as best we can. We'll give it a moment for some of those questions to flow through. Dan and Jeff will be responding to them, and they'll do their best to respond to as many as we can today. Again, if we don't get to it, solarsunshot@arena.gov.au, and James will be on that inbox and able to respond to you as soon as we can. I'll now pass to Jeff to answer the first question. Jeff, you ready to go?
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to the team for the presentation today and everyone for attending. So the first question is about a specific project around a fully automated factory for deployment. And I think just my answer here is that we don't want to respond on specific projects necessarily today, but the round is open, and that does sound like something that may be of interest, and you should definitely get in touch. If you do have a project and you're not sure if it fits within, as Matt just mentioned, please get in touch, drop us an email to the Solar Sunshot at arena.gov.au website email.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Dan here. I'll take the next question, which is in relation to universities and the eligible expenditure rules. So the funding announcement does specify that for research institutions, we allow a certain level of on-costs to be, I guess, included in eligible expenditure. So that's something that we typically do across a range of programs. So nothing particularly new there. We've picked that up for this program. And the other part of the question is just, what is the role of universities? We're not specifying, what types of entities can either apply directly or be involved in project consortia. So really just looking for, the right parties to be involved in whatever the project is, whether it's a round 1B study or a round 1A implementation project. We welcome a range of parties to work together for the benefit of the project. There was another question around the match funding, which probably hard to be specific. We don't have any specific requirements about the nature of the match funding, but again, typical to ARENA programs, we do expect all projects to have contributions other than ARENA, and we look to minimise the level level of ARENA grant funding that's required for any project. So we'll be looking at each project and asking the question, what is the right level of grant funding and what should different parties be able to bring to the table in terms of contributions, whether that's cash or in kind. So probably not much more to say on that one at this point. But again, as Jeff said, happy to discuss that with particular applicants around particular projects. Just looking at the next round of questions. Jeff, I don't know if you've got one that you want to jump to while I scan.
Yes, so great. So I have a question here on how the program addresses the overall objective to providing very low cost solar PV. And so the program is specifically designed to help commercialize innovation that will drive down the cost of solar. So that is in the manufacture or deployment of solar PV at scale, and hopefully that will help address the very, very low cost of solar PV that we're trying to reach.
I'll jump into one that I saw, which is around, I guess, the definition of solar PV and the mention of silicon. The program is not confined to just silicon PV, but I think we do obviously mention silicon in the supply chain because that's the main supply chain that we're thinking about here. But we are able to support non-silicon based solar PV technologies. So hopefully that answers that question. But obviously other scope requirements around, I guess, level of commercial maturity. So this program is not around early stage technologies, and we specifically state that in the scope of the TRL levels that we discussed in the presentation.
We have a question here around mounting systems for integrated PV and whether we can support product commercialization. So I'm going to interpret that question a little bit, but feel free to follow up with another question either here or via email if I don't answer your question specifically. But the mounting systems for grid scale solar PV are very much within the scope of the program under 1A, and certainly would love to hear about your project if that were the case. I think if this were talking about mounting systems for on-roof, that might not be within the scope of the program, but would still love to talk to you, and please get in contact.
I've got a question here. I think we mentioned the types of studies that we're interested in funding under round 1B. That's in section 3.1 scope requirements. And we do call out there that we're looking for commercial scale manufacturing. We talk about at least TRL 8. We do mention a number of areas, but those are not exhaustive, and we say they're including but not limited to these. So we mention polysilicon and conversion of quartz to metallurgical silicon, ingots and wafers, and then we say broad solar innovation and automation, which covers a range of things. So that's just some examples. We're pretty I guess broad-minded in terms of the types of projects that may benefit from ARENA support in the form of a feasibility study or an engineering study. So again, if you think that there's a project that requires that level of support that's broadly aligned, please come and talk to us. We're not looking to be too limited in the range of things that we can include there.
I'll take a question here on regarding merit criteria D, would a project be disregarded outright if it's not commercially viable without ARENA support? So it's a very good question. So ARENA steps in to help address the gap where a project is not commercially viable, but would have a pathway to being commercially viable. And that's very much what we aim to do here at ARENA, helping get across that gap.
It's a quick question here around recycling. We haven't included recycling in round 1A, but I think ARENA does have interest in recycling and end of life generally. So we're definitely interested in speaking to people through our open program and just generally to understand what opportunities people see in end of life. Yeah, unfortunately, I guess not including in the scope of 1A at this stage, because we do see, I guess, the need to have some level of focus and not spread ourselves too thin at this point in time, but potentially subsequent rounds. There's a question here around can you give an example around community engagement aspects of a project? I guess similar to Jeff's answer to the first question, hard to give examples that are too generic because every project is different. But for every project, we'll be looking to the consortia and the applicant to think about what is the nature of that project, what is the nature of the local community, how can the project deliver value to that community in terms of whether it's jobs or other economic opportunities, and generally engage in a very positive way. So very, very project specific, and wouldn't want to I guess generalize what is obviously a very complex area and a very bespoke area. But looking forward to engaging with projects on that front.
So I have a question here asking for some examples of specific projects for 1B round. Could you please repeat these? So I'm just going back to the detail that was mentioned under 1B. And the scope of 1B differs to 1A, and the scope includes studies on commercial scale manufacturing solar PV technologies, including but not limited to polysilicon and conversion of quartz to metallurgic silicon, ingots and wafers, broader solar innovation, which is consistent with achievement of ARENA's Solar 30-30-30 goal.
So not a lot of questions coming through, and I'm not too surprised. I think there's a lot of information in the guidelines and the funding announcements, and obviously we've also got frequently asked questions published on the website as well. If there are other questions, as we said, very happy to deal with those on a project-specific basis, but we can also update the FAQ document as any common questions come through that we think would benefit from being shared more broadly. Just wait for a moment to see if there's any other final questions, and otherwise, if not, we'll wrap up and look forward to engaging with applicants over coming weeks and months.
So I just received a question. What is the best channel to reach out in relation to projects that are not eligible under the program, but could be of interest to ARENA? As Matt mentioned earlier, so the ARENA email is proposals@arena.gov.au. Please feel free to contact ARENA via that link. Thank you.
And there's one more question that's just come up as well in relation to studies. Is there any limitation on the length of the project? No, there's not. I think commonly we would see studies being anything from 6 months at the short end to a number of years, maybe 3 years for a detailed study. So that would be the general expectation, but not looking to put any limits on that. And the second element of that question is the requirement for the studies to be public. So we do require knowledge sharing for studies. We wouldn't require the entire detailed study to be published, but we would normally expect a condensed version to be made available, under the principle that other similar projects can benefit from being from that knowledge being available in the public domain at an appropriate point in time.
Question there, Dan. Glass manufacturing for solar panels included? Is glass manufacturing for solar panels included? That could come within the scope of program, so please do get in touch if you have a project in that space.
Okay, well, we might wrap up there. As we said, that doesn't mean that any questions that pop up can't be answered. So please do get in touch via the email address, and we can certainly deal with many other questions as they arise to help people understand what may be of interest under both round 1A and round 1B. Is there any other wrap up from Matt or others? Or are we happy to close there?
Well, good. Thanks everyone for your time today.
Thank you very much, everyone.